Hello, hello. Welcome back to Loki's Librarian and our weekly books and booze review. I am your librarian, Katrina. If you are new here, welcome. This is where I review a book and mix up a cocktail in the process, usually. Come back to that in just a moment. This month we jumped into the Wayback Machine and took a look at some ancient history, making this week's book of the week The Mind in the Cave by David Lewis Williams, although his Amazon authors page lists him as J. David Lewis Williams, so it might be a J, I don't know. Now, usually I do mix up a cocktail. However, Googling paleo cocktail gets you a host of paleo diet-friendly cocktails, but not really anything I wanted to mix up this week. So I was talking to my husband about this, who asked, hey, what was the oldest alcoholic beverage? And I said beer without hesitation, which I learned from reading The Immortality Key last year. Actually, almost exactly a year ago. So then he asked what was the oldest brewery, and the good news is the oldest continuously operated brewery is Weihenstephaner, which is right here, right? So I am drinking one of their offerings, which is apparently available. I don't know if it's nationwide, but it was at least available in Nevada, so I was able to buy one of these. And that's what I'll be drinking today as I go through The Mind in the Cave. It's topical. I mean, Weihenstephaner is located in Bavaria. It has been in continuous operation since 1040 Common Era, or AD. So instead of a cocktail, I'm going to enjoy some beer from the oldest operational brewery, which is doubly appropriate since Neanderthal Valley is located in Rhine-Westphalia, Germany. So German beer for German Neanderthals, who played such a pivotal role in the advancement of Homo sapiens. Let's do this. It's a solid beer. It's a solid offering. Definitely a wheat beer. Yeah. Good stuff. All right. So The Mind in the Cave is looking at who, or rather what type of culture, created the cave art found in the Paleolithic caves. Primarily, the biggest, most well-known one is Lascaux, France. I'm probably going to mispronounce the hell out of some of these things because the French use vowels as a suggestion. But there have been caves found in Spain and other European countries, but Lascaux is probably the most famous. And, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, the obvious answer is Homo sapiens, and I think that there are very few archaeologists, historians who would argue with Homo sapiens having been the one to create the art, given the comparative sophistication. And we know that Homo sapiens, essentially, everybody living right now on the planet is a Homo sapien, all humans are. About 150,000 years ago, Homo sapiens developed, and we've basically remained the same ever since. True story. And it's interesting, I mean, his layout, but I have some problems with some of his conclusions, some of which is not the author's fault, and we're going to circle back to that in a little bit. Now, he does start with laying out 3 different time bites, is what he calls them. The first one is the Volpe caves in France between 13,000 and 14,000 years ago. And clearly this one is wholly imaginary, since we have absolutely no idea exactly when Paleolithic humans first began creating this artwork, or even necessarily what motivated them. Although Lewis Williams certainly attempts to answer that question in this book. I mean, we have a rough approximation of when the artwork was created through carbon dating. It's not exact, I don't believe. Now, his second time bite is 1660 AD. Isn't that interesting? I had no idea. In Place Niaux Cave, it's Niaux, Place Niaux Cave in Ariège, France. In 1660, this cave was visited by Reuben de la Viale. We don't know this because he left any kind of detailed record of the wonders found therein. We know this because he presumably saw the art, assumed his own contemporaries had created it, and literally signed his name on the wall. Like, carved his name and the date into the wall. So we know he was there in 1660. The Roman alphabet, the Roman letters, alphabets, kind of gives a dead giveaway that this was definitely something within our common era, right? In 1660, this was kind of a well-known local tourist attraction, like everybody knew it was there. And it seems that defacing local tourist attractions for your own hubris is not, in fact, a uniquely American tradition. It has always existed. We have literal graffiti in Hagia Sophia in Turkey saying Halfdan was here, like literally, right? Yeah, I think that was mentioned in The Last Viking that I read back in 2021. Also, Rome has very old graffiti along the same lines. It's famously mocked in Monty Python, but...
What's this then? Romanes eunt domus? People call Romanes, they go the house? It says Romans go home.
that's a real thing. Now, I get that Americans get a lot of shit for being inconsiderate asshats when visiting other countries, and that's not necessarily an unfair critique. There's certainly Americans behave badly everywhere. It's not helped with the Torrons of Yellowstone page, also a fair critique, although, to be very fair, that's not all Americans who are doing that either. Anyways, I'm getting off track here. All I'm saying is this is not just American. We come by this honestly by way of our European ancestors who apparently have been carving their initials into shit since, we started carving our initials into shit. Time bite number 3 is 1994, which addresses the discovery of Place Chalvert cave in Ardèche, France by 3 French spelunkers who are specifically looking for Paleolithic art, and they found it. Now, these 3 vignettes create a very riveting opening scenario, which the book kind of fails to deliver on. Sorry, I really, really wanted to like this book. I really did. But it kind of slowly devolves into a postmodernistic spiel of words that all ultimately say a whole lot of nothing. It was very disappointing. Now, having said that, it's not all nothing. There are some good things in here, making this book kind of a mixed bag. Lewis Williams makes some pretty compelling arguments for a shamanistic society, having created the cave art, using parallels with the Bushmen of the Kalahari, which are more correctly known as the San, and the Native American artwork and practices, which are found all over the Great Basin. I mean, I could think of at least 4, Paleolithic arc sites just within a couple hours' drive of me. So he points out the shamanistic practices of both of those tribes, and I'm completely fine accepting, or both of those societies, I should say, not tribes, because the San is completely alternate, completely different continent. I'm completely okay with accepting the concept of shamanistic cultures in Paleolithic Europe. I think most people who are not stuck in a social justice hellhole of white people bad and white people who are shamans are culturally appropriating the concept from native tribes. I think most of them would accept the concept of shamanism in ancient Europe, given especially that shamanism simply means a spiritual practice that involves a practitioner. This is straight off of Google. Shamanism means, quote, a spiritual practice that involves a practitioner interacting with the spirit world through altered states of consciousness, such as trance, end quote. That's all it means, all right? And shamanistic societies still exist in modern Europe by way of the Sami tribes in Norway and Sweden. But this book is very academically written, which makes for very, very dry reading. He does spend some time trying to debunk other theories of cave art, which you kind of have to do when you're trying to put forth your own theories, show why they're wrong and why you're right. I get it. Including art for art's sake, art for magic purposes, and social construction. And I'm not going to lie, with all the reading I've done over the last few years, when social construct and diversity entered the chat, my eyes rolled very hard. And when he mentioned Karl Marx and Michel Foucault, no joke, I almost threw the book in irritation. This is where he loses me, and it is very much his fault, this part of it, because he's claiming that the creation of art through shamanistic practices led to social division of an otherwise perfect Marxian communist society. He brings up another artist, and I don't, Max something, that he mentions, who had this idea first, and he's just building on it, expanding on it. He thinks that Max was ignored because he was a communist. I think Max was ignored because politics have no place in ancient history. Modern politics have no place in ancient history. I'm sure they had their own political classes and clusterfucks that have nothing to do with us, and trying to force our current modern shit show on 40,000-year-old history just does not fly with the vast majority of people. Yeah, I that was very frustrating, and he lost me at that point, and it was his fault. Claiming that he does claim that social division is not necessarily bad, but then fails to provide any examples of why he thinks it might be a good thing. Meaning politics have entered the chat, and it was a very frustrating thing to read through. And it became a mental slog to finish reading the book at this point. Basically, I ended up dismissing huge chunks of it as ideologically driven, postmodernistic drivel. And that's very frustrating. Now, I don't believe it was art for art's sake. I think he does a fairly good job debunking that, meaning that people just created it because, hey, it's art, and I wanted to create it. Art for art's sake is this stupid fucking banana taped to a wall. It's art. No, it's not. It's a banana taped to the fucking wall. Oh my god. Frankly, Brian Muraresku in the Immortality Key, and even Terence McKenna in Food of the Gods, which wasn't my favorite book, but he made some stronger arguments for altered states of consciousness having moved humanity forward than, Mr. Lewis Williams does. Chalk it up for the amateurs being better writers than the academics. However, that was not necessarily Lewis Williams' argument. He wasn't claiming that altered states of consciousness moved humanity forward, only that it created a social class different from other Homo sapiens back in the day, and this led to a division that could have created the artwork in the caves. Which arguments he incidentally contradicts himself with, specifically when he discusses the artwork at Lascaux, France. Mostly saying, these were the visionaries, the dreamers, he even calls them the autistics. I swear to God, he refers to it as autistic mind frames, right? Because they hyper-focused on this one thing, and that created a social divide, and, rawr, capitalism bad. But then he talks about the large 18-foot-long bowl in the Hall of Bowls at Lascaux, which he says must have been a community project. So, did the artwork divide the community, or did it unite them in creating this epic piece of art? And shamanism and magic are not necessarily mutually exclusive, which is also apparent during his discussion of the sand artwork in Africa. But he very much dances around that. It's not solid communistic practices to discuss magic and, altered states of consciousness. He even says that, he's not saying, he very specifically says multiple times, he's not saying that they created these arts while in a trance. That would have been impossible, except that people are creating artwork while under the effects of hallucinogens. Some pretty powerful and moving artwork, in point of fact. I'll throw a couple of pictures up here so you can see. Now, all of that I had a hard time with. I was like, you're kind of losing me here in your political view, pal. You're losing me in the political view. Things that were not his fault, and I genuinely can't blame him for this because it was information discovered well after the book was published, are the conclusions that he draws regarding Neanderthals. This book was published in 2002, and this becomes highly relevant. He specifically cites that Neanderthals were already in Europe when Homo sapiens moved north from Africa, and this is more or less a historical fact. I don't think any Paleolithic historians or archaeologists would dispute that. There have not been any Neanderthal remains found outside of Europe. That's where they were. They were there. He specifically cites that the Neanderthal were made extinct by the Homo sapiens, basically outbreeding the Neanderthals, and explains how that could be possible. And basically says it's the result of Homo sapiens being genetically superior, and there was no crossbreeding, as while the Homo sapiens and Neanderthals were physically similar, the biological differences were too severe. Basically, any interbreeding would have resulted in genetically sterile offspring, kind of like cross-breeding zebras and donkeys, which will give you zonkies, which are sterile, or tigers and lions, creating the sterile liger. The reason this is not Lewis Williams' fault is, again, this book was published in 2002. Genome mapping in May 2010 was published in science.com, I think, or Science Magazine, definitively shows that basically everyone with any European ancestry at all has between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. Which means not only did Homo sapiens mate with Neanderthals, they did so quite extensively. I mean, consider this. About 8% of the Chinese males share the common genetic traits with Genghis Khan, who died in 1227 CE, so about 800 years ago. 800 years later, there are still 8% DNA floating around. Okay? Neanderthals went extinct 40,000 years ago. They no longer exist as a species. So for 4% of their DNA to still be floating around modern human genomes means that they were crossbreeding so extensively it was practically a tribal one-for-one swap. I mean, basically the Homo sapiens came up from Africa, saw there were people already in Europe, and decided to make love, not war. And then the genetic traits of the Homo sapiens were genetically superior from a Darwinian point of view, if you will, evolutionary point of view, and so those are the traits that stayed on. Now, he also believed that He also believes that Neanderthals could not have created artwork because they did not have the capacity to vocalize their dreams the way that Homo sapiens did, basically arguing that because they're two-dimensional arts, they were not created as representational of three-dimensional animals, but as something they saw, almost like a moving picture, right? People have very, very vivid dreams, so basically they're creating recreations of their dreams on the walls of the caves. And because Neanderthals could not vocalize this, it must be the Homo sapiens who made that. And this has also been disproven as of 2021, when new studies suggest that Neanderthals absolutely could vocalize in a speech-like pattern. And so Homo sapiens come up from Africa, see the Neanderthals, communicate with them via verbal vocalizations and hand signals, crossbreed, boom, we have modern man, and the Neanderthals die out. But there's nothing saying they couldn't have created this artwork. Now, again, I don't fault him for the hypothesis that they weren't speaking, because that's been disproven with research that came out well after this book was done. I mean, he wrote it in 2002, so 19 years later. But with that information, taken in addition to his belief that it was a dreamlike state of shamans that led to the creation of cave artwork, I'm not at all sure that Homo sapiens did create all the artwork in the Paleolithic caves. I mean, most tellingly, it's the handprints. I mean, see, some of these prints, right, were made by tracing around the outside of the hand, kind of like making a turkey artwork at Thanksgiving when you're 5 in kindergarten, right? Others are made by painting over the hand, creating a negative handprint, meaning you place your hand over the wall and then spray paint around it so you have a white hand and then red paint around it, right? So it creates this negative imprint on the wall. And this is done, basically they would put the paint in their mouth and then spray it like that. It would create this imprint on the wall, okay? Now, some of these prints are very small, which leads archaeologists to assume that women and children were involved, which perhaps they were. There's no reason to say they wouldn't have been. Or perhaps some of those handprints were made by Neanderthals, who were much shorter and smaller than Homo sapiens. When you're on an all-protein diet, which the hunters back then would have been, hunters back then would have been, they tend to grow big and strong when you're on an all-protein diet. This has been borne out again and again by, well, you just look at the Vikings. The Vikings were enormous. They remain enormous because they don't grow a whole hell of a lot of wheat in Norway. But they do hunt, they do fish, and they do whale. Now, other arts that nobody else has been able to explain are the finger flutings. I mean, basically, someone at one point ran their fingers through the soft clay mud of the walls, which leaves dragging marks in the clay. Now, when I was reading his description, my thought was that somebody walking towards the back of the cave where it's very dark was putting their hand on the wall and dragging it like this while they're walking to make sure they stayed close to the wall. Possibly for some of them. But when you look at the Google images, that certainly is not responsible for all of them. And I mean, nobody really knows why they were there, why they were made that way, except if you accept the sophisticated artwork of, the paintings, the bison and the ibex and the hall of felines in Lascaux. They have cave lines drawn in there. They have images of a hunter being gored or speared. If you accept that that was made by the sophisticated Homo sapiens, then perhaps the more simplistic art of the finger flutings and handprints were made by Neanderthal. Maybe it's not an either-or situation. Maybe we're seeing evolution of art, basically, from the Neanderthal to the Homo sapiens to the mixing of the two tribes. I don't know. Nobody knows, right? And it's extremely unlikely that anybody will ever know, unless Elon Musk or some future billionaire turns their attention to time travel. It's always going to be a mystery. I do think that a shamanistic society is highly likely as an explanation for some of the art. But with history going back 40,000 years, I categorically reject his idea that the creation of the artwork led to social division and the creation of a class system. There's literally no evidence to support that. There's no evidence to support that they didn't already have a class system with a leader of the tribe and a shaman on their own before the Homo sapiens ever came along. I mean, this is something we're never going to know, without the help of Elon Musk. Just saying, you might want to jump on that after you fix the government. That's all I'm saying. But modern politics have no place in the study of ancient history. None. communist Marxist theory and thought, capitalism as a thought, really has no place in anything prior to the 18th century when those actual political theories developed. It's kind of why I ripped the shit out of Johanna Katrin Friedrichsdottir's book when Valkyrie, the Women of the Viking World, back in 2021, because she was trying to claim that the burqa woman was in fact transgender. Rip the shit out of that. Fuck you and your modern ideology, lady. That has no business in the study of history. And neither does saying that we all lived in a perfectly happy commune until, damn those Homo sapiens created art and division. Or when Terence McKenna said that we were a happy goddess worshipping women cult until, men introduced war. I just ripped that apart during Food of the Gods. Man, do not politic up my history, man. It has no business there. Anyways, that's it for this week. I've ranted enough. I'm going to chug the rest of this beer. If you like what you saw, don't forget to subscribe. See you guys next Sunday. Bye.